Welcome to the next lecture. If you can't join them, beat them. You see the picture here of Preston Brooks beating up Charles Sumner. Yes, that actually happened, and it was actually in the building, and the guy got a little bit in trouble. We'll talk about that later, but this kind of stuff is kind of characteristic of what's going on in the 1850s, which might feel characteristic of what's going on in the current era of the political climate, where it really feels like neither side can get along, neither side can stand to be in the same room together, and that's certainly the feeling in 1850s. And of course, that unraveled into a civil war. So the next president that we pick up where we left off in previous lecture is Franklin Pierce. He wins 1852 election. He is a Democrat, but he's from New Hampshire, so he's a Northerner, but he is a pro-slavery guy. He actually thinks that the abolition movement is the problem, not slavery, but the abolition of slavery is what's causing all of this turmoil, and so he is not a fan of the abolition movement. We're finding increasingly there are more and more Democrats in the North. They may or may not be pro-slavery, anti-slavery. They're not certainly going to be as vocal as most Southern Democrats are. And pretty much everybody in the South is a Democrat at this point. But there will be more politicians in the North, as we'll see, other prominent ones who are also Democrats and who either don't really care one way or the other about slavery as long as, things keep going, or are for slavery. Very few are not for slavery. That's a different party, a different group of people. And so because of the stance he took and several of the things that went on, he becomes increasingly unpopular in the North. And eventually the Democrat Party actually just kind of sets him aside because he's too unpopular to go on in the next election. He is responsible for the Gadsden Purchase, or at least signing it and making it happen. That is the last little bit of the United States territory that was purchased from Mexico in finalized in 1854. It has to do with railroads and going around some mountains and things like that. You may recall a map in a previous lecture, I think at the tail end of the last lecture, that showed all these different sections of the United States and when we added all these territories. So this is the final piece of the continental United States. We still, of course, are going to add Alaska and Hawaii years and years later. But now we have what we'd call the lower 48. Of course, most of the states, or many of the states, aren't created yet either. There's still a lot of open territory, a lot of questions about what's supposed to be going on. And that issue of slavery is a huge issue. What do we do in these new territories with regard to slavery? Do we let it happen? Do we prevent it from happening? Or another idea that's come around, we'll talk about in a bit, do we let the individual territory decide? And that sounds pretty democratic. In practice, it's going to be a disaster. But we'll get there in a few minutes. He also attempts to annex Cuba, or suggests that we annex Cuba, and he actually has some people working on that. There's a huge uproar over some of the things going on during this period of time, and so that doesn't happen. The idea was we should get hold of Cuba, and if Spain won't sell it to us or give it to us or whatever, then we should go to war for it. And Cuba is very close to Florida. It is a very productive island. He wanted it to become a slave state, those kind of things. Of course, it didn't happen. Cuba becomes an issue much later in 1898 with the United States and with Spain. We will go to war at that point, but Cuba will remain its own country after that. And in the end, Pierce is viewed as kind of one of the worst or the weakest presidents that we've ever had. Certainly he ranks down in the bottom 10 or 15 of the 45 presidencies that we have undergone since George Washington began. Probably a guy you've not heard of. So some of the big events that are taking place here in the mid-1850s are, one, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this is a way to try to break the sort of stranglehold that the Missouri Compromise had over this, at least the territory that was the Louisiana Purchase. I didn't necessarily include all the territory we got from Mexico, but see, that was a big deal. What do we do with that territory? And remember, the fear and the paranoia that's been developing over the last several generations or decades is that we're going to lose slavery. The North, the free states are going to be bigger, there are going to be more of them, and eventually they'll do away with slavery. And so the slave states are getting very paranoid. But at the same time, there is a growing movement in the North, the abolition movement we've talked about in the past, that does want to do away with it. Or there are others called free soilers, men like Abraham Lincoln, who want slavery to remain where it is and not be allowed to spread anywhere new. And of course, many of them prefer that slavery would go away, but there's no mechanism to do away with slavery short of some kind of constitutional amendment, which is exactly, of course, what happens. But that's all kind of broiling around and all these different issues that are going on. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act comes out and it creates these territories, and it's a little premature. There was a lot of debate in Congress about it. Many people were opposed to it. It kind of got forced through. They don't have all the deals done with the natives and all those sort of things. It's pretty messy. And this idea of popular sovereignty is going to be tested here. And it's pretty simple. It's that idea I just mentioned, that the territories themselves should be able to decide whether or not they are slave or free. So when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed and signed into law, it actually repealed or undid that Missouri Compromise. Remember, there was a line drawn, and that line dictated that territory north of the line would be free and everything south of the line would be slave. There was hardly anything left south of the line. So remember, that plays into this fear and this balance problem. We're already slightly off balance because we added California, but these southern slave states are afraid that it's going to go away. And it's the backbone of their economy, and so they don't want it to go away. So in Kansas territory, what happens? You have people moving to Kansas. Some are pro-slavery, some are anti-slavery. Of course, they tend to not mingle so much. Then there's an election that happens. The territory, once it gets large enough, can elect a legislature. And so in that election, I have the word bogus election on here because that's what it is. In that election, there are like twice as many votes cast as there are people who are eligible to vote. And that should tell anybody, even if you're not very good at math, that there's a real problem with this election. Well, they elected kind of a pro-slavery government, and clearly that was an illegal and bad election. And the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, just kind of sat back and twiddled his thumbs and said, well, I hope everything works out, because remember, he's pro-slavery. Meanwhile, the anti-slave people who recognize that this is a bogus election are going to basically set up their own government, and then there's going to be a kind of civil war that ensues in the territory of Kansas. And that's called Bleeding Kansas, and it lasts for almost 2 years. And hundreds of people are going to get killed, a whole lot of property is going to get destroyed. It's a horrible, horrible situation. And we'll meet a guy named John Brown there. He'll figure in one of the videos, the video called Division, I believe. They'll talk a little bit about John Brown in that. He's kind of begins, I guess, part of his career here. John Brown is so anti-slavery that he will kill anyone who gets in his way or anyone who's opposed to him. So he's a fanatic. And as you'll learn in that film, and as we'll talk about later, depending on where you're from, he's either a hero or like a freedom fighter, or he's a terrorist. And that's often the way it goes. So Kansas then devolves into this sort of guerrilla war for a couple of years. The President of the United States basically does nothing about it and lets it go. And so it's a huge mess. And Kansas is the one and only time where this issue of popular sovereignty is going to get tested. And it's a huge issue. It's an issue not just in Kansas, but across the whole nation. That's what makes it such a problem. If they had just left it alone and let it be Kansas or any other territory, it might not have been a big deal. But this is front page news everywhere. The slave states have an interest in making sure Kansas goes slave. The anti-slave people, the northern states, have an interest in making sure the territory goes anti-slave. And what ends up happening, as we said, there's twice as many votes. Many of those votes came from people living in Missouri, which is a slave state, and they just went to Kansas and they voted. And again, nobody really did anything about it, so it created this conflict called Bleeding Kansas. A lot of people get killed. Not long after that, we have the caning of Charles Sumner. That's the picture that we looked at the beginning. If you can't join them, beat them. And the idea is these people could not get along. And Preston Brooks is the gentleman on the left. He beat up Charles Sumner, who's a senator from Massachusetts, the guy on the right, an older guy, because he had attacked slavery, he attacked its practitioners, as you see on the screen, including this guy's cousin, Andrew Butler. The reality is, though, that stuff happened every day in Congress. All these guys would get up there and they would hammer on people. They would deliver these fiery speeches and name call and yell at each other. And then he would sit down. And the next guy on the other side of the aisle, the Democrat in this case, would get up and he would do the same thing. And it'd just go back and forth. It actually would have been way more interesting probably than most of the stuff that goes on today. Of course, they didn't have speakers, so it was all very oratorical in style, and these guys were yelling and kind of foaming at the mouth almost. And Preston Brooks takes exception to that, and he canes this guy and beats him up really, really bad. Preston Brooks gets censured and removed from Congress, but then he gets reelected later. So I bring this point up not because this is really historically significant. This event doesn't really make any difference at all, except that it illustrates how bad things are getting, how difficult the relationship is between the Democrats and this new Republican kind of party that's coming along. Or we could just say between the slave states and the free states. Basically, it's the same thing. This relationship is falling apart. They're just fighting. They're devolving to physical violence now. And while we might like to watch that a little bit on TV, I mean, you've channel surfed, I'm sure, and then you hit C-SPAN and you see all these people sitting in a room on their mobile phones and a guy's talking or a lady's talking and no one's really paying attention. It's super boring. And then you keep going. We might want to see them duking it out or something like that. But again, this is just illustrates how horrible the relationships are. Another thing that happens right here in the mid-50s is the Dred Scott decision. So we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas going on. And while that's going on, they're arguing about all that stuff and slavery, and this guy's beating another guy up in the congressional building. Then we have this big Supreme Court case, Dred Scott. We call it the Dred Scott decision. It's really Dred Scott versus Sanford. And what happened is Dred Scott was owned by this person, and he had lived in, he was from Missouri, but he ended up living in two northern states for a long period of time. And then they went back to Missouri and the guy died, and Dred Scott argued that because he took us to a northern state where slavery was illegal, then I was set free. And so now that the owner is dead, he's suing for his freedom, him and his family. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court completely blows the case up, and they say, you're not even supposed to be in here, that black men, black people, African Americans do not have citizenship in this country, whether they're slave or free, it makes no difference, and that the Constitution was not for them. And this ruling was made in 1857. So essentially he says, you can't be citizens, you shouldn't even be in this courtroom, and his petition for freedom is denied. Now, eventually, Dred Scott, within a couple of years, I think, will get his freedom. They will be set free. But this ruling then becomes the Supreme Court. When they make these kinds of decisions, it affects a lot of different areas. And so now this idea that black Americans, and they can't be citizens. And so that causes some real problems. That kind of ups the ante here. The anti-slave people are really fired up about this. The pro-slave people, of course, are all on board. I mean, most of the Supreme Court were Southern Democrats anyway. And so, they ruled this way. Some have said this may be one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court ever made. There's some pretty bad ones out there. But this sets the stage for, again, the Civil War and for segregation and for a number of things that are going to take place. So he goes on and basically says that, the whole thing with the Missouri Compromise, you can't do that either. You can't pre-plan what's going to be slave or what's going to be free. So even though that's already been repealed, now the Supreme Court, in the same decision, makes a ruling on that. I don't know how they connect the two. You can Google these things and read about them in some detail. But that's what happens to Dred Scott. So again, it sets a tone. The Supreme Court said black people are not citizens. And of course, Native Americans already have been declared non-citizens. And so this is setting up a really difficult situation. And again, civil war is right around the corner. So poor Dred Scott again loses the decision, but eventually he will be set free. So when 1856 rolls around, nobody wants Franklin Pierce anymore. I gotta say this one last thing about Franklin Pierce. He's viewed as being very weak. He's well known to have been a drunk, although the word is he really wasn't during his presidency, but he kind of was in front of it and behind it. I mean, he himself was a great public servant. He was a general and in the Mexican War, and served in various capacities elsewise other than president. But they lost all of their children at very young ages. One of their kids was killed in a train accident right before his inauguration, kind of right in front of them. And I suppose that kind of thing changes a man. I'm not trying to argue in his defense. I'm just saying, people are people and they have real lives. They're not just a photograph in 4 years or 8 years. They're actual human beings. And he had a tough time, but he's viewed, again, being pretty far down the list of bad presidents. And along comes James Buchanan, who's also going to be viewed as someone who's far down the list. But at the time, it was thought James Buchanan is a big, strong, politically powerful, very knowledgeable guy. He had been Secretary of State and a lot of other things, a Washington guy kind of through and through, and that he's going to be able to kind of get everyone together on the same page. Like he's almost going to have to be able to manhandle the two sides together because he was this sort of large, imposing figure. And he pledged, he said, I'm only going to serve for one term and then I'm out. And I don't know if he said that because he knew a storm was brewing or if that was really something he wanted to do. Wouldn't be the first president to do that. Remember, James Polk did that. I think Pierce did that, but I think he changed his mind as things went along. So here comes James Buchanan. He did support the Dred Scott decision. He is a Democrat, pro-slave guy. He totally supported that decision and protecting slavery and so on. He supported what's called the Lecompton Constitution, which has to do with Kansas. So Kansas pro-slavery develops this constitution and tries to enter as a state, but it gets voted down because remember that decision is up to Congress. Well, Buchanan supports them. It doesn't happen. Eventually, Kansas will be admitted as a free state later in 1861. And so, again, he's a big supporter of these kinds of things. He's not able to corral either side. And so they're just fighting and fighting and fighting together. And then he is the president when 7 states will secede from the Union. Now, they secede as a result of Abraham Lincoln's election. But these 7 states, and I'll show you a map in a bit, secede while James Buchanan is president. And he essentially says, well, it's illegal for you to secede from the Union, but there's really nothing I can do about it. And he leaves it there. He tries to negotiate a little bit, but South Carolina and these other states are not going to listen to that. And basically what Buchanan does, he just wimps out. He just says, in February, by February, 7 states have declared their independence from the United States. And he just basically says, sorry, can't do anything about it. And in his mind, I'm pretty sure he's thinking, I only have a month left to be president, so good luck, Lincoln. That's your mess, not mine. And so he leaves in early March. Lincoln takes over. It's a mess. And again, that's the subject we'll get into in the next lecture. We'll pick up with Lincoln, and we'll get into the Civil War, of course. So that's James Buchanan. During Buchanan's presidency, we have what are called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They happened in 1858. You can see Abraham Lincoln on the left side of the screen without his beard. And you can see Stephen Douglas. He's on the right side. These guys couldn't be more different. Douglas is a very powerful, you can see he's the incumbent senator from Illinois. He's very popular. He's been involved in all kinds of political decisions. He's very young. And he's wealthy and he's bombastic and he yells a lot and he wears fancy clothes. You can see his tuxedo here. And he goes against this guy, Abraham Lincoln, that barely anybody's heard about. Lincoln's a lawyer from a small town. You remember he grew up in a log cabin up in northern Illinois in the middle of nowhere. He's basically self taught in the law, super intelligent. He's not very good looking, as you can see. He's super tall and lanky, almost weirdly proportioned, and he's got this country sort of sound. And again, he's wearing a suit, but it never totally fits, and he's just a totally different personality. Yet both of these guys are super intelligent, and they're going to go after each other, and they're going to have a whole bunch of debates. In fact, they give 7 debates around the entire state of Illinois, each congressional district, because in that point in time, the Congress or the state legislature actually elected their senator. There was no popular vote then. And so they're doing these debates. They're famous, so famous that today in the world of competitive speaking, which I know you all follow, it's almost as popular as NFL football. Not really. But anyway, they have an event called the Lincoln Douglas debates. That's how big these were. And I wish that we actually had some recordings of these things, because from everything I've read about them, they're really great. But Lincoln lost. Stephen Douglas wins. They're running for that Senate seat. Stephen Douglas wins, remains the senator. But this brings Lincoln to prominence because these debates are publicized and carried by national newspapers. It seems strange to me, but that's how big and how great these debates were. And so Lincoln's name then is now circling in this national arena, even though he's relatively unknown by anybody. Again, he served 1 term in the Illinois House of Representatives, 1 term in the U.S. House of Representatives representing Illinois, and basically he's been a semi-successful lawyer that no one cares about. And then all of a sudden, as you know, he'll become president of the United States. So it's this debate that sort of raises his name to the level where he could be considered to be a presidential candidate. Which brings us to Harper's Ferry, October 1859. You see a picture, a drawing that's made later of John Brown. And again, in the Division video, they will talk a little bit about this. John Brown and his followers are going to attack a U.S. arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and their intent is to start a slave revolt. I don't know what happened. He didn't send the email, or something didn't happen, because when he got there, the town fought back against him. They end up taking some prisoners, but the town militia forces them to basically lock themselves into this armory. And eventually the U.S. Marines are called in to deal with it. And this is where we actually meet people like Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, and I think Longstreet is there. These are famous names from the Civil War, which is right around the corner. Robert E. Lee is actually on vacation from his command, which is in Texas at the time. He's home in Virginia, so he's called in to command this thing. But the Marines blow in there, and they killed a lot of John Brown's men, captured John Brown. John Brown then, as you see, will get tried for treason against the Virginia, and he will be executed by hanging on December 2nd. Another weird tie-in, John Wilkes Booth, the man who shot Abraham Lincoln a few years later, watched this particular execution. So the picture you see in the background is this great drawing of John Brown, and notice a couple of things. So we looked at some pictures in the past. I directed you to, for example, the Bloody Massacre picture in particular. This is another piece of propaganda like that. So you see how John Brown is twice as big as everyone else. So he's this larger than life figure. You can see the pose he has, and he has a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. That is a Christ-like pose. He is being portrayed as a Christ figure, or a Moses-like figure, which is also another Christ-like figure, that he is leading the people to the promised land. Of course, this picture is done after the Civil War. You can see the American flag or the federal flag on the right side and one of the Confederate flags on the left side. And so he's this sort of figure. And again, to people who wanted abolition or to free slaves, he becomes this great hero, sort of. But to slaveholders, to Southerners, he's really just a terrorist. And like I said earlier, he will kill anyone that gets in his way. So he was both. which is often the case. So Harper's Ferry, he doesn't actually start a revolution. He ends up getting hung instead. So pretty difficult times. But that's again indicative of what's going on in the 1850s. It's just turning to violence. Every time you turn around, there's violence, 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 which is going to explode into a war. So in 1860, we're going to have four legitimate candidates, all four of which get electoral college votes. And all four of them are pretty legitimate candidates to be president. So in the picture on the top here, the bottom left person is John Breckinridge, Democrat. He was the current vice president. He was Buchanan's vice president. Buchanan, remember, is going to step down after 4 years. He's a Democrat. He supports having a slave code in the territories, and he supported popular sovereignty, as you can see. So pretty typical Democrat thought process there. Then here's Abraham Lincoln, who's a representative of this new Republican Party, which is a free soil party. Remember, we're not going to get rid of slavery, but we're going to make it stay where it is. Although there are a lot of abolitionists in the Republican Party, because that's kind of the closest thing they have. And so he doesn't like slavery personally. He wants to prohibit it in the territories and contain it. That's that free soil idea. Lincoln's a classic example of that. Yes, a few years later, he will desire to get rid of slavery completely. So people do change. So you don't want to pigeonhole someone based on some view they had when they were younger, right? You got to be careful about that. Well, then you have the guy in green, that's Stephen Douglas. So this great debater and orator and powerful senator, well, he's thrown his hat in the ring for president too. He does not want a slave code in the territories, but he does support popular sovereignty. Then you have John Bell, the yellow, the gentleman on the right. He's what's from this new party called the Constitutional Union Party, and it's just exactly what it sounds like. He wants to avoid this controversy and just figure out a way to keep the country united. And he's from Tennessee, and you can see those three orange states. What is that? Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. Those states are going to vote for John Bell. Those are states on the border. Those states are where a lot of the fighting is going to take place. And those states know that if a war breaks out, a lot of the fighting is going to take place in those areas. And so they're kind of looking ahead and saying, this is not going to end well. Let's try to nip this in the bud. So they vote for John Bell. The green, you can see almost the entire South votes for John Breckinridge. Most of the North votes for Abraham Lincoln. All right. And then, of course, the brown states are the votes that Stephen Douglas gets. All right. So it looks kind of like John Breckinridge is going to win. But when you count up the actual electoral college votes, Lincoln gets 60% of the votes, which is more than enough to win. He only gets 40% of the popular vote. I mean, his name wasn't even on the ballot in a lot of these southern states. So that's how the system works. It's very strange, especially when there's more than two legitimate candidates going on. The votes get really kind of squirrely. But Lincoln is declared the winner, and then that leads to the secession of 7 states. And it starts with South Carolina. You can see on our map those pink states at the bottom. South Carolina, naturally, right? They're the ones that 30 years earlier were going to nullify law during Andrew Jackson's presidency. And they came really close to kind of duking it out with the federal troops. They didn't. Well, now this happens. Lincoln's declared the winner, and they basically said, Lincoln's going to try to do away with slavery. We need to leave now while we can. And so they declare themselves seceding or free from the Union. They're no longer beholden to the Union. And you can see over the next couple months, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then finally Texas, by the way, against the wishes of Sam Houston, but they basically told him to go away, Texas joins the Confederacy. Now, those 7 states will create a confederacy. It'll take a few months for them to kind of get things going. We'll probably talk a little bit about that next lecture. Then you see these sort of light brown or maybe orangey states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They too will secede, but they'll wait until after the incident at Fort Sumter, which we will talk about at the beginning of the next lecture. So they kind of want to see what happens, and when for the little battle at Fort Sumter happens, they'll leave. So we'll explain that later. The Brown states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, which actually separates off of Virginia during the war, Maryland and Delaware, and the District of Columbia, which is Washington, are going to stay in the Union. Those Brown states are slave states, but they will stay in the Union. Now, Missouri was kind of occupied by federal troops because there was all kinds of problems there, right? These other states, though, are going to stay in the Union. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're economically more tied into the Union than they are to the South, even though they have slaves. And their slaves are not in danger until the war is over, basically. So we'll explain that, too, in the next lecture. So, and all green states, of course, plus Oregon and California are also free states, and they're going to be part of that. So you're going to have this, you can see the border, this big red line there. So most of the fighting is going to take place in Virginia and West Virginia and Maryland, Tennessee, and then along the border here in Arkansas and a little bit in Texas, and kind of around the horn there, but a lot of it along that border. It's going to be a pretty rough time. So this is what happens. And remember, those 7 states at the bottom, they seceded, and James Buchanan just kind of went, nothing I can do about it. Good luck, Lincoln. And then he exits the White House in March of 1861, and Lincoln then jumps on, and Lincoln has to go, now what do I do, right? And Lincoln's been saying, I'm not going to do away with slavery. I can't do away with slavery. I don't like slavery. I don't want slavery to go anywhere new. Can't do anything with it where it already exists. But it didn't matter at this point. At this point, those slave states have already decided that the future is bleak in terms of them keeping slavery. So remember, we have a lot of issues that go into that. You have the other European countries, especially England, have already done away with slavery. So it seems natural that other places are, and other countries have been. You have the fact that there's way more territory in the United States that looks like it's going to go free, which is going to severely overbalance Congress in that direction, and then they can pass an amendment to do away with slavery. There's a much larger anti-slavery movement in the North in the late 1850s than there has been. It blows up after 1850 and the renewal or the rewriting of the Fugitive Slave Act. In the book Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in the early 50s, and that made a huge impact on people. Something like 300,000 copies of that book were sold. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in response to the abuses that people are beginning to see as a result of this new Fugitive Slave Act. Remember, people are getting kidnapped who were never slaves. And that creates a bigger uproar. So these slave states are seeing the writing on the wall. And it is a fact that every single one of those states, when they seceded, in the documentation that they published, the very first reason and the very biggest reason they all stated they're leaving is to protect their right to own slaves and to have a slave system. All of them said it. So these arguments that it's about states' rights or, whatever, they're not correct. I mean, those are there, but they're down the list, and they're really something that developed way after the Civil War to try to explain away some of the challenges. So anyway, Lincoln's like, I'm not even president yet, and all this is happening. What do I do? When he takes over president on March 3rd, which is when presidents used to be sworn in until 1936, he has a mess on his hands, and he has to figure out what to do. So the next lecture is going to, whoops, that's the wrong picture. Not so Civil War. Not this Civil War, the other Civil War. That's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. Just got, I think, 2 more lectures with this one and then the one following the Civil War lecture, and then you are finished for this class. See you next time.